Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, April 3rd, 2025. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. This week, Chris Colby, author of the Homebrew Recipe Bible, Methods of Modern Homebrewing, and How to Make Hard Seltzer, joins me to look forward to spring. We talk about a handful of deliciously quaffable styles to bring you into warmer weather up here in the Northern Hemisphere. If you want to support us financially, check out patreon.com/basicbrewing, and many thanks to everybody who's helping out in that way. If you go to patreon.com/basicbrewing, you can see a long list of stuff that you can access if you sign up as a supporter. Many thanks to the new Patreon subscribers who are signing up every week. Your help is very much appreciated. Financial supporters this week will see an early release of a video episode about a delicious mead that Steve put together. Steve Wilkes, that is. It features New Mexico honey, cacao nibs, saffron, and tart cherry juice. It was way good, and at only 7% ABV. I think I'll add it to the list of the suggested things to brew for spring. It would be, as easy as mead is. Easy to put together and delicious. He added a bit of acid blend to make the fruit flavor really pop, and the chocolatey flavor from the cacao nibs provided a nice base note, very complex and drinkable at the same time. I don't know much about saffron, so I don't know if that came through or not, but it was very tasty. Along with the early release, financial supporters will also get the recipe. Speaking of recipes, I'm gathering my ingredients for the two recipes that I'm brewing in response to my latest Mash Your Luck challenge. I had to go to multiple sources this time. I went to Yakima Valley for the pound of Harlequin hops, Northern Brewer for the Canadian Malting Pale Ale malt, and the rest came from Dave at Small Batch Boutique over there in the Tulsa neighborhood. I try to support Dave whenever I can because he and Desiree supported us for so many years, and they're awesome folks. At the end of it, I'll have two lagers, that starter Pilsner with a bit of maple syrup that we talked about on the show, and the giant UK triple IPA that Matt and Josh talked me into with a metric poop ton of Harlequin hops at the end of the boil and in dry hopping. I can't wait to put those together. I think it will be great. I'm planning to brew those beers with L51 Never from our friends and sponsors at Imperial Yeast. Never is a Canadian lager strain that is a salute to our neighbors to the north. L51 delivers smooth, well-rounded beers with a subtle malt foundation and a clean, malt-forward finish. Imperial has also introduced L55 Kampai, their highly flocculent Japanese lager yeast that's ready to bring bright, crisp, and ultra-smooth lagers to life. Bruce at Imperial has told me there's one more continent to be represented by lager strains coming up, so stay tuned and keep an eye out for that. You know we love Imperial yeast with 200 billion cells in each easy-to-open package. My stir plate is usually dusty because I don't use it anymore to brew moderate gravity 5-gallon ale batches. And I'm not planning to use a starter with the smaller lager that I'm going to brew. My airlocks are usually bubbling before bedtime, and with lagers, usually before breakfast. Ask your local homebrew store about L51 Never, L55 Kampai, and all the dependable deliciousness from imperialyeast.com. And check them out at imperialyeast.com. Okay, let's talk to Chris about some suggestions for delicious springtime beer styles. Chris Colby, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Hey, James. Thanks for having me on the show.
Sure. Spring is trying to spring around here. It's not sprung entirely yet, but we got flowers blooming. We got my nose running. Must be spring. You're probably a little ahead of us down there.
Yeah, well, I've got my spiderworts are out. Baby blue eyes are out. I've got some other stuff sprouted, and I got 57 tomatoes in my garden. And then like another 60 that I don't know what I'm going to do. Sell them to somebody, I guess, as starters.
Do you know how to can tomatoes? Do you have a pressure cooker and all that stuff?
I do, and I'm guessing I'm gonna have to find out how to can because I've never. I grew 40 tomato plants one year, and it was like we had this bowl of fruit in the kitchen that was just like always heaping with tomatoes. And then every like week or so, we'd have to take them all out and clean out the ones that had because there'd be fruit flies.
Oh
Because
gosh.
we couldn't eat that many tomatoes at once, and so they would start to go mushy and rupture, and then there'd be fruit flies, and so it was like had to develop ways to.
Well, you're going to have to become like an old pioneer woman. You got to drag out you got to dig a root cellar and
Yeah.
get out your, what's the brand name? Bell jars? Is that the Ball
Ball jars.
Not Bell. Bell jars, another thing.
Yeah.
But another way that you ready for this segue? Another way that you can preserve food for the future is make a beer.
Make it into beer.
Smooth. I didn't even plan that. I asked you today to come up with some suggestions for springtime beers because it's on the way, and I'm busy doing my latest Mash Your Luck challenge. But for those normal people out there who want to brew a beer on purpose, I thought it'd be a good idea to suggest a handful of delicious, drinkable beers that could lead us into spring. And I think in looking at your list, there's not a lot of hops. Was that on purpose?
Sort of a lot of the springy beers. I mean, the most expressly spring beer is Maibach. That traditionally is literally a spring beer. The other ones are, just hey, it's spring. This can be a good beer. So yeah, I didn't purposely shy away from hops, but it sort of ended up that way. I suppose there's nothing wrong with like a session IPA, like an all day IPA, for a spring beer. That could be quite good.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't think of it.
And even though Bach is meant to be a little higher than average, around 6% or so, it's still in in today's standards that's still pretty sessionable.
6% is not what it used to be.
It's not your daddy's 6%.
Yeah.
So let's talk about my Bach. We recently, I recently brewed a Bach, and I thought it was pretty tasty. It's a little darker than I was expecting. I guess I was expecting a Maibach because a Maibach is meant to be kind of lighter than a regular Bach, right?
Yeah, it should be like a pale Bach beer. Sometimes they call it a Helles Bach, and it's basically about a 6% alcohol beer. Pale, not like straw like a Helles or anything like that, but sort of golden. And it's got a Maibach has, as Bach beers go, a little bit more bitterness, and there also might be some light, sort of malty, toasty character in there from a little bit of Munich, or perhaps even a very little bit of Melanoidin malt or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, again, as we talked before in the show about Bachs, there's that something that I characterize as Bachiness that sets it apart from, like, say, a Helles, which we'll probably talk about a little bit. But it's got that kind of, like, melanoidin-y, decoction-y kind of light, toasty character in there. And in my Bach, I used a little bit of like 3 ounces of melanoidin, and that was good. I think a light touch may be good, and some may not even. Adam was saying that he might not even use melanoidin, but a little bit of a more interesting malt in there would bring a little toast to the party.
Yeah, it's almost like I mean, I think of my box in some ways it's just like a little bit stronger Pilsner
Mm.
almost, but then with some of the melanoidin thrown in because it's uh, about 1% ABV higher. Uh, it's Pilsner's usually more bitter, uh, and my Bock is a step down from what a normal German Pilsner would be, but it's more or less, or at least one way you can think about it and not be completely wrong is stronger than Pilsner, but just not quite as hoppy.
Yeah. So how many IBUs are we talking about?
Uh, in the ballpark of 30.
Hmm.
It it varies, and you can go high or low.
And for a
But
6% beer, 30 is not too high.
no, it's pretty good. It balances with enough extra that like, oh, there's hops in this.
And the name Maibach refers to the month of May, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
In the history, I think. One little nugget of wisdom that hasn't fallen out of my head. But it's probably a beer that's brewed over the winter time and maybe lagered over the winter time, and then you come out of the depths of the winter, and you have festivals, and you get ready for summer. It very I like the idea of a very drinkable lager, and I've been brewing more lagers lately, mainly because Imperial's been putting out lager yeast strains. So but it's out. It used to be out of my comfort zone, but now I'm sort of hitting my stride with the lager making. But I guess we should. Can you give people some tips just in case they haven't been listening lately about brewing a lager, and some guidelines of how you can brew a lager that will ferment well and taste clean and nice the way a lager should.
Yeah, the biggest thing, I mean, and the thing that makes a good homebrewed lager versus a mediocre or worse one is just running an ordered fermentation. Like you've got to pitch enough yeast. You need to pitch more yeast. For a 5 gallon batch, you need to pitch more yeast, maybe as much as 1.5 times as you would pitch for an ale. And then of course lager fermentations run cool, and uh, you've got to keep them in the specific range that the yeast work well in. Often it's between 50 Fahrenheit and 55. And, that's can be fairly easy in the summer if you live certain places in the northern United States. Uh, but if you live in the southern United States and then spring comes, I mean, you need some active cooling.
Mm-hmm.
You need more than the wet t-shirt. You need a fermentation chamber. So yeah, pitching enough yeast, uh, keeping the temperature within the boundaries. It's gonna raise a little bit when it really starts. And if you just even if you have a fermentation chamber, you should look in. Um, if you have those little fermentation temperature strips, you can
Mm-hmm.
stick them right on the carboy, and that'll it'll give you a pretty good idea of how what the temperature is in the carboy, and then you might need to uh, turn your thermostat up or down to keep the peak of fermentation from getting uh, too high. And then of course the thing about lagers is well, two things about lagers. It takes the yeast, since it's running colder, longer to absorb diacetyl.
Mm.
So you want to, at the very end of the fermentation, well, assuming you're not krausening the beer, but if you're not, then you should or at the very end of the fermentation, let the temperature creep up towards 60 degrees and let it sit for like 3 days, and then check, physically sample the beer to see if the diacetyl character is gone. And then you can start cooling it down for lagering, which you can do at well, you can do it almost any temperature you want,
Mm-hmm.
presuming it's you know cooler than lager fermentation temperature.
You can do that in a keg too. You can just
Yeah,
transfer it to the keg, and
yeah. A lot of people do it just at refrigerator temperature, which is absolutely fine.
And of course, it doesn't mean you have to let it sit at lager temperatures for a while. You can you can be like me and be impatient and start drinking it. It won't be as clear probably,
Yeah.
as if you let it sit for a month or two at a colder temperature. But it's all up to you.
Then
And and
you keep pulling samples, and then finally one day it's like, oh, this is perfect. And then you
yeah,
go, I'll have one more, and then it's,
on the in,
yeah,
dang
oh,
it.
yeah.
Yeah.
I've sampled many beers to death before they reach their peak.
Uh, and the of course the philosophy folks have come up with experiments brewing certain lager strains at slightly higher temperatures, into the ale zones,
Yeah.
and you can get a similar effect. Maybe sometimes you can even discern the difference, but I think one of the fun things about doing a lager is actually going through the process. And sometimes it's a challenge, but it's that's why I do it. It's kind of fun to follow the rules sometimes and come up with something that's delicious at the end of it. But hopping, just bittering hops, right? I mean, there's no
Just
hop.
one dose of
Yeah,
bittering hops to get to your, whatever your target is, around 30 is, middle of the road for a beer like that. Yeah, you don't want a lot of late, at least if you're trying to brew one that's reminiscent of an actual Maibach, you don't want a lot of the late hops.
yeah. No spices, no no
Yeah.
fruit. But something that can be a little spicy is saison, which is the next beer on the list, and saison is one of those that it's tricky to nail it down as a quote style because it's typically a traditional beer that's just kind of brewed in Belgium and around, sort of farm by farm by farm, and kind of whatever the brewers brew is what it is. Are there any common characteristics that people, tend to use to lump saisons together?
There's a lot of variables. They range from being fairly pale to darker colored versions. They range in strength. A couple things that are generally uh, hang together pretty good. There's usually a good deal of wheat in them, uh, and they're usually highly carbonated.
Mhm.
They're dry beers that are highly carbonated, and beyond that, they're not really particularly bitter, but they may sort of seem hoppy because the dryness, makes the actual bitterness more uh, discernible. And then also they can be hoppy on top of that, where because they will add dry hops
Mm,
or
mm.
late hops or dry hops or um, things like that. So, but like you say, it was back in the day, and even today with commercial saison brewer, they all have their own take on the thing. DuPont is different than the other, La Chouffe and
But it's the yeast character that usually, uh, when I think of a saison, I think of like a clovey, spicy
yeah, they got the
yeast
Belgian
character.
yeast strain, which also varies among uh, the saison brewers. But yeah, that's a constant. Is some sort of quote unquote Belgian-y yeast.
And temperature, fermentation temperature, can have a lot to do with the character that you get out of those kinds of yeast strains. So,
Yeah, a lot of home brewers who like really are really into Belgian beers like to they'll they'll find the yeast strain that they like, and they'll slightly underpitch it,
mhm.
but then let the temperature climb during fermentation. The fermentation just heats itself up, and depending on the strain, some of them like you get up near 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and it still works. It's not making paint thinner at that point. It's still making beer. Um, so yeah, there's very individualistic. The yeasts are all have their own characters, and then if you can handle them different. Like if you held it at like normal ale temperatures, you would get one result. But if you slightly underpitch it and let the temperature climb, it's completely different. You get much more esters and other sort of phenolic yeast characters in the latter.
And Brettanomyces can enter the picture too, right?
I think it can, but I don't think it's actually traditional in a saison. Um, I read somewhere that it's not really a Brett beer, but then again, there's a million variations on it, so.
You can't tell me what I can't do with my saison. So what would your, and again, we're not trying to design a recipe, but in your mind, when you start to think about putting together a saison recipe, what do you start with? What's your malt bill like?
I would brew one of the paler versions. That's just what I like. And I would go with a mix of like Belgian Pilsner malt and some wheat malt. And I might throw in 5 to 10% unmalted wheat.
Mm.
Sort of give the grain mill something to do. And then, there's all sorts of variations. I would leave out any actual spices. I wouldn't sour it, but I would use a highly attenuative yeast, and I would slightly underpitch, not drastically underpitch, and I would probably just the sort of beers I like. I would let the temperature climb, but not way to the top of the yeast strain's ability. I'd let it get warmer than the average ale, but not you know not that high. At least thinking of the strains that I've worked with, and then basically try to get a really dry beer, and then just carbonate the living crap out of it, like get to 3 or 4 volumes of CO2 compared to average craft beer, and an American Pilsner. Those are right around 2.6 volumes of CO2 usually. Champagne's around 6, and you don't want it that frizzy, but I would definitely shoot for like 4, maybe even 5 or 4.5.
And get special bottles if you're doing
Yeah, you
bottle.
should save your actual saison bottles.
Now, would you dry hopping in this style? You said you were talking about a little bit of hop character, and would you use aged hops in a saison?
I would dry hop. I probably wouldn't use aged hops. Just I don't know. That might be traditional. I mean, if I was trying to nail a very specific brand of beer, like if I was trying to do Saison DuPont, I would read up on everything that's known about them. Known, or in a lot of cases of Belgian beer, suspected, but not verified, and try that. And I might go for that. It's something, they do use aged hops in some Belgian beers.
It's more lambics I'm thinking of, I guess.
Lambics are definitely used aged hops, yeah, but it creeps over into other styles.
But you don't want like a New England IPA level of juicy, fruity hops.
No, I'd pick European hops because I would want it to be a saison. I mean, if I wanted to make a hybrid like saison Nipa, then yeah, use some like New Zealand, crazy tropical fruit hops and Galaxy, and then and do that. But if I was trying to brew a saison, I'd probably try to at least start at a base of like this is a something that would fit in the normal within the Venn diagram of saison. And yeah, I mean you've got a lot of landing room there.
Yeah. And it's a good opportunity to go buy some samples of different saisons and kind of see what's out there. Now, so a little more straight. We mentioned these before, but a Helles lager is another super. It seems like a super simple recipe, but it requires some finesse to do it well.
Right. Helles is like, to one way of thinking, almost the exact opposite of a saison. You've got a
Mm.
very narrow target. You don't have any room to like, I think I'll try this. Not if you're brewing a traditional Helles, you won't. Uh, it's a pale Pilsner, often made only from Pilsner malt. Um, ABV a lot of times is around 5. IBU's right around 20, enough to balance it. And it's generally one, or almost always one, bittering addition. Noble hops, something clean without a lot of varietal characteristic. And it's a beer that, yeah, the recipe is simple, simple, simple. So it's the skill of the brewer
Hmm.
uh, that either pulls it off or doesn't. And 90% of that, besides the obvious stuff like using fresh ingredients, is again running an ordered fermentation. Get enough yeast in there, uh, keep the temperature under control, and it should turn out good. Um, and Yeah, because you want moderate to high attenuation. Um, and Another nice thing, which you've done actually, is you can use brewing a Helles as sort of a yeast starter
Hmm.
for a stronger lager beer. Because when you get done, the yeast shouldn't be that stressed. You should be able to take some out, and I mean, depending on how involved you want to get, I mean, you could just pour new wort right into the carboy once it's drained, or you could take the yeast out and wash it a little bit and subsample it. But anyway, yeah, a Helles, really well brewed Helles, can be a supply of yeast for your Maibock, say, or and then, or maybe just put it in your fridge for your Doppelbock, in the fall,
Mm.
late fall.
Yeah, and it really does. Giant beers really do take off like a rocket when you pitch a brand new high gravity wort on top of the yeast cake from a previous moderate gravity beer. It takes all the guesswork out of the, especially
Yeah,
if it's something that you don't want any significant yeast character. If you just want a clean fermentation, boy, that's the way to go. And then you got two beers.
yeah.
So
You're
what's it?
usually when you if you pour new wort on top of, like, for a 5 gallon batch of beer on top of a 5 gallon batch of beer, you're over pitching.
Mm-hmm.
But on, like you say, on one, a beer where you want a clean fermentation, uh, it'll usually work great.
What's the difference between a Helles and a Pilsner?
I'd say Helles is usually less hoppy. Um, Sometimes it's less gravity, but they overlap. Uh, I think I would say the main difference is the level of hops.
Mm.
A German style Pilsner has a good, I don't know, they're 30 to 40 IBUs a lot of the time, different ones. Like if you've ever had like a Bitburger, the pale beer, crisp, drinkable, but it's got a very firm bitterness to it.
Mm.
Whereas a Helles is much more balanced.
Very drinkable.
Very, very drinkable.
What one hazard of doing these shows is I get thirsty by the end of
Yeah,
it, and I've only got water. I got stuff to do today, so I've only got water. Unfortunately,
I should go get some Bitburger now that I mention
Bonzo goes to Bitburger. No, that's
it.
something else. Um, so let's head from the European continent proper over to the British Isles. You sug-
Bum, bum, bum. Bum, bum.
You're suggesting an English mild or a dark, which is another.
Dark mild, yeah.
It's a more sessionable beer, but one with a lot of character.
Yeah, this would be a good, and this is not expressly a spring beer, but it's, I, as a gardener, I think of like, when I'm done with gardening, I like to go have a beer, and I don't want to have like a freaking barrel aged imperial stout with whiskey in it. Like I want a crisp, drinkable beer, and I don't know. English mild isn't crisp, isn't particular, and a character associated with it, but it's low gravity, very very sessionable. And you can an English mild you can brew. They run the gamut from pale through amber to dark. That usually more on the edges than in the middle. Um, and so, yeah, just get some nice English pale ale malt, something good. Get some crystal malt or caramel malt in the 60s to add a little bit of toffee flavor to it. If you're going with a dark malt, yeah, a little bit of chocolate. You can add if you're brewing a dark one, you can even add the dark roasted malt to the point, or even you can use it wouldn't be normal, but you could use the stout, unmalted barley.
Mm.
Uh, and you can add it to the point where the beer is actually a little bit roasty.
Mm.
I mean, generally it's mild. It's not, you don't want to get into the coffee, like dry stout range, but a little bit of roast isn't going to hurt you. And as a home brewer, I would say a big thing to worry about, or not worry about it, or to consider is because the gravity is so low, like don't oversparge.
Mm.
If you garner the usual amount of work that you do from a much larger grain bill, uh, you may have oversparged, and you'll end up with some tannins in the beer, and that'll lead to sort of stringency.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, figure out how much you can get from your grain bed, and then you may have to add water to reach your pre-boil volume.
And then, since it is a low gravity beer, you don't want it to be too thin at the end. Is crystal malt going to do that for you, or would you mash a little higher to
Crystal
get
malt's
some?
going to help you. Yeah,
Hmm.
mashing a little higher will help you. Also, you don't want to pick, the most attenuative English yeast out there. It would be better to pick something, like what's reputedly the Fuller's strain. It's Weiss 1968, and is it 002 in White Labs, and I don't know what it is in the newer ones. But pick something that's not known for its high levels of attenuation, and yeah, mash a little bit higher. You don't need to go nuts. Don't be shy about putting crystal or caramel into that. You can get up near 10%, and then also don't overpitch, and don't let the fermentation heat up too much, which shouldn't really be a problem. But
Mm.
everything you can do to keep. You don't need to necessarily uh, lower fermentability to the lowest possible point, but let run brew the beer overall so that you leave some things behind, a little bit of sweetness, a little bit of a body, and then also that's uh, further accentuated a little bit because I mean, you start at such a low gravity that even with a little bit of crystal and mashing higher or whatever, it doesn't really necessarily taste that sweet,
Mm.
you know. But another thing is that they aren't heavily carbonated beer. Shoot for around 2.5 volumes of CO2 somewhere in there, and the sum total of all that uh, leaves you with a beer that it seems like it has a little bit of body to it, and it does, but it's also kind of somewhat of an illusion given that you started with so little grain.
Right. And not very bitter. But do we taste the hops at all? Are there any late addition hops?
Yeah, a little. I mean, the name English mild sort of tells you what the brewers shoot for. It's not meant to be, a beer that knocks you on your, uh,
Keister?
yeah, on your keister for any reason, alcohol, bitterness, any flavors or whatever. It's meant to be, a session beer where you're sitting in a pub and it's just like, we'll have another round. Yeah, let's have another round. Yeah, wall them up.
The New Zealand saying.
Uh, famous beer drinking New Zealand saying, yep, in my mind.
You want anything? Wall 'em up. And and then the last thing on the list, inside jokes are the funniest, aren't they? Uh, the last that you have on the list is an American one, the golden slash blonde slash light ale, and this takes me back. Whenever I think of like a golden ale, I think of, and of course I've had some good ones, but the worst I've had are kind of they can risk being like even a little buttery or just in my memory of just not being I don't know crisp enough or just kind of being blah. But I have had good golden ales or blonde ales. So these especially in the early days of brew pubs, this brewing a blonde ale or a golden ale is kind of a self defense strategy, right? For the pub.
Yeah, it's for when people show up and someone's looking at it, what's all this? And then when the waitress comes by, well, what do you got that's like a Bud Light? And then she can recommend the blonde ale or the light ale or it was very much
Innocuous.
yeah.
Inoffensive.
I mean, the best ones were actually good. They were generally all malt instead of malt and adjunct. They were usually not offensively bitter. They weren't trying to drive away their, but they sometimes had a little bit more hop character and yeah, usually relatively highly attenuated, crystal clear because they were sort of meant to be the ale version of an American beer, and well carbonated, to the normal level that craft beers are carbonated. And yeah, it was all you could tell when you went to a brew pub. There were brew pubs where the brewer wanted to make something good, and there were brew pubs where the brewer was just like, if they're drinking that, they can deal with the diacetyl you mentioned, because a lot of the first stage of brew pubs, they were, I forget what it was called, but it was like the 7 Day Wonder, and they brewed with this yeast strain that was supposedly give you beer in 7 days, but there was a diacetyl creating style, and if people rushed it through, their beers through, didn't let it condition a little bit. Sometimes you got really really buttery beers,
which contrary to Harry Potter lore, that's not good.
Yeah.
Not desirable. But yeah. So if you were to properly brew a golden slash blonde ale, you would feature American two-row, I'm assuming, since it's an American style.
Yeah, 2-row or a blended 2-row and 6-row would work.
And then some crystal malt in there, just a little bit of like 20 Lovibond, just a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. You don't, since they're, the originals were meant to mimic American Pilsners, you don't want to develop a bunch of color. But a little bit of crystal, I'd say 5% or less, and then, 20 or, I wouldn't go higher than 30 ever. If you're trying to be, true to the historical beers. Yeah, and then moderate in strength, like right around 5%. And again, the bitterness varied. The better ones had a little bit more bitterness than what's the American Pilsner range? It's like right around 12 IBU, I think.
Yeah.
And blonde ales, probably got up to about 20 IBUs, which is not powerfully bitter, but you at least taste a little bit of hops. And there were bottled versions of these too. Like I remember Catamount had a beer called Catamount Gold. It was actually really good, just good, drinkable, straight up beer that even in, my growing beer snobbiness and desire for hops at the time, I still like, yeah, this is a beer I could drink a ton of.
Uh,
Um,
yeah, it would be a fun one to brew and put it up against like a nice Helles, and compare and contrast. Spend an
yeah,
afternoon on the front porch with samples of each in each hand, and
yeah, and it would be similar because if you use a neutral American strain and you adequate pitch rate and run a good fermentation, there's not going to be a lot of esters there.
Mhm.
It's not going to have it'll have the lack of esters that a lager has, although it wouldn't have some of the characteristics of a lager. Like there's a lot of times there's a little bit of sulfur in there, which at small doses can be good. And there's just, yeah, I don't know how to describe it. There's that lager flavor, or maybe it's lack of ale flavor. I don't know, but there's a little bit of a difference. So it would be good, and you could make a comparable, a beer that stands up. I think
Yeah,
if you were,
I think on my as I'm thinking, I'm imagining myself back in the '90s, sitting at the brew pub and the Ozark Brewing Company, not the Ozark Beer Company, but Ozark Brewing down on Dixon Street, and drinking a golden ale. I think of it as just a teeny bit more malty than say a Helles or a Pilsner. Just a little bit more residual sugar, not cidery. That would be another defect.
yeah,
But just super drinkable, little bit crisp, maybe a little bit of hop character, but nothing that'd scare away the
right,
the casual
yeah.
drinker.
Because back in the day, brew pubs, I think they faced a lot of times someone would, groups of people would go there. Hey, let's try this, and almost every group would have someone who just couldn't get over the idea that beer was amber or dark, or it had to be light colored and it had to taste like Pilsner, or and so in order to keep, in order for those people to say no, let's not go there, let's go to whatever sports bar instead, they needed to have a beer that they could placate that bit of their clientele. And so, yeah, like I said, the best ones made it a little bit better, a little more malty, a little bit more hops, and it's a lot of times a little bit of character to the hops,
Mm.
using Cascade instead of, the U.S. grown Saaz, or what they use in American Pilsners. Um, and yeah, so they're like people used to talk about gateway beers. If you tried that and we're like, oh, that's not too bad, then maybe one of your friends could talk you into trying an amber ale, or go all out and try a porter.
Oh, slow down.
Yeah,
We all know dark beers are too rich and heavy.
yeah, and heavy and strong.
Well, excellent. I think that's a good list. That's a good list of five. Good drinkable beers. That won't get you in too much trouble, maybe.
Mostly, like the Saison tops out at 7.
Yeah, I guess the Maibach being 6.
My box is 6, yeah.
Yeah,
But otherwise, yeah,
be all right.
you're in the 5 range or lower if you're doing the mild.
Yeah, and it's a good beers to sit out on the porch for the 3 days in Arkansas that it's nice to sit out on the porch.
Also, Saisons aren't real amenable to like chugging them, like really going.
No.
Unless you really like belching, you got to slow down on a Saison.
Well, it tastes like something. Again,
Yeah,
it's a complex thing that you kind of want to slow down and kind of, oh, what's that? It's warmer now. Now I taste this.
mm-hmm.
And then my wife walks away.
Yeah. Ugh.
She goes and talks to somebody about basketball. All right, Chris Colby, thank you very much, sir. This is fun, and makes
Always a good time.
makes me want to brew something. and drink something. All right. Till next time. Thank you.
Okie dokie. Talk to you later.
Many thanks to Chris. I think those are all delicious suggestions. If I weren't brewing my 2 Masher Luck beers, I think maybe I'd take a swing at that golden ale, especially after talking them down a little bit in the show. It's a style that really can be brewed well, and maybe I can do it. I think I can. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com, and please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Check out our mobile-friendly shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody supporting us through our Patreon page. Special goodies coming your way. Check that out at patreon.com/basicbrewing. It's all until next time. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dotson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. In the meantime, stay well and stay tuned. So long.